You checked your bank account 3 times today, not because you needed to, because something in you does not trust the number to stay the same. Before you prayed this morning, before you read a single verse, you had already calculated what is owed, what is short, and what might not stretch to the end of the month. And somewhere in that calculation, without ever naming it out loud, you made a decision about whether God could be trusted with your money before you ever asked Him to be. This is not a video about budgeting. This is a video about 6 specific habits. Habits so ordinary you have likely done at least one of them this week that Scripture directly identifies as spiritually corrosive to your finances. Not bad luck, not a bad economy, not a lack of opportunity. A pattern the Bible names in plain language as something that keeps the hand of blessing closed. And most believers are doing at least one of these habits so consistently they no longer recognize it as a habit at all. It has simply become how they relate to money. I want to be very clear about something before we go further. God is not primarily concerned with your bank balance. He is not measuring your spiritual maturity by the size of your savings account or the brand of your car. He is concerned with your heart, and money is simply the place your heart shows up most honestly, because money asks a question your Sunday morning worship rarely does. What do you actually trust when trusting costs you something measurable? Every habit on this list is not a financial strategy problem. It is a discipleship problem wearing a financial disguise. And the reason it hides so well is that our culture has trained us to talk about money in the language of wisdom and prudence, while Scripture insists on talking about it in the language of the heart. Most conversations about Christians and money stay comfortable. Give more, budget better, trust God, work hard. Those things are true, but they are not specific. Few conversations name the quiet, precise habits Scripture actually identifies by name, the exact behaviors, not the vague categories. Today, we are going to name them one at a time, slowly enough that you can recognize yourself in at least one of them before the video ends. Item 1. Withholding what belongs to God. There is a specific dishonesty that many believers have made peace with. Treating the first and best portion of their income as fully theirs to allocate, and only afterward considering what, if anything, belongs to God. Consider a believer who tithes only after every bill is paid, every subscription renewed, every want satisfied, and then gives whatever happens to be left, sometimes very little, sometimes nothing at all, and calls it faithfulness because the intention to give was technically present. This person would never describe themselves as withholding from God. They would describe themselves as being responsible. And that is precisely what makes this habit so difficult to see in the mirror. It wears the language of maturity while functioning as avoidance. Malachi chapter 3 verse 8 asks a question most believers never sit with long enough to answer. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. The verse does not soften the word. It does not say shortchanged. It does not say delayed. It says rob, a word that assumes something was taken that did not belong to the one who took it. I want to be very clear. This is not about a formula or a percentage functioning like a magic number that unlocks blessing. It is about order. When God's portion is what is left over instead of what comes first, you have quietly told Him where He ranks among your obligations, whether you meant to or not. This week, before a single bill is paid, decide what belongs to God and set it aside first. Not because the amount changes God's provision for you, because the order changes your heart toward Him. A believer who gives first, even a modest amount, is practicing trust with the very first transaction of the season. A believer who gives last is practicing self-reliance with everything up front and calling whatever remains an offering. Item 2. Manufacturing debt out of impatience. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 7 states it without ceremony. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Scripture is not condemning every loan or every mortgage. It is naming a spiritual reality most Christians never connect to their everyday spending decisions. Every dollar borrowed to acquire something you are not willing to wait for is a small transfer of authority over your future to someone who does not share your values, does not pray for your family, and has no stake whatsoever in your obedience to God. The lender's only interest is repayment. Yours was supposed to be stewardship. Think about a household that finances a lifestyle it cannot yet actually afford, not through emergency, not through crisis, but through simple impatience with the process of building something slowly. The furniture arrives before the income does. The vacation is booked before the savings exist to cover it. The upgraded vehicle replaces the paid-off one that still runs fine because the new one felt like progress. Each individual purchase feels small, reasonable, even earned. The servitude accumulates quietly, one convenient monthly payment at a time, until an entire paycheck each month exists only to service decisions made in moments of impatience. That is not provision. That is a door open to a lender who now holds a claim on decisions that should have belonged to you and to God alone. The warning here is not that debt makes you a worse Christian than someone who has none. It is that impatience, left unexamined, will keep finding new doors to open long after this particular loan is paid off because the habit was never really about the furniture or the vacation. It was about an unwillingness to wait. Item 3. Treating comparison as a financial plan. You might be thinking, everyone looks at what others have. It is human nature. It is not sin simply to notice. And that is true. Noticing is not the danger. The danger is what happens next, in the quiet moment when noticing stops being an observation and starts becoming a standard your own spending begins answering to without your permission. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 30 says, "A sound heart is life to the body, but envy is rottenness to the bones." Envy does not stay contained in the heart where it started. It moves. It migrates into the wallet. It buys the upgrade you did not actually need because someone in your circle already had one. It rejects the modest, reliable option in favor of the impressive one, not out of necessity, but out of comparison dressed up as a preference. And rottenness in the bones is not a dramatic, sudden collapse. It is slow, structural, and largely invisible until the entire frame is already weak and something finally gives. The truth is this: your finances were never meant to compete with anyone else's. They were entrusted to you, specifically, by a God who does not measure your obedience against your neighbor's portfolio, your co-worker's vacation photos, or your cousin's new kitchen. Examine your last 5 significant purchases honestly. Ask which ones were actually decided by need and which ones were decided by comparison wearing the disguise of a preference. If you are honest, at least one of the 5 will be difficult to explain without mentioning someone else's life first. Item 4. Refusing to plan and calling. It faith picture a believer who keeps no budget, makes no record of income or expenses, and describes this as trusting God with the details of provision. Money arrives and money disappears, and each month is a small mystery solved only in hindsight, if it is examined at all. When gently asked about it, this person says God will provide, as though creating a plan were somehow the opposite of trusting Him, rather than one of the ordinary ways trust is expressed through responsible action. Here is what is actually happening underneath that scene. This is not faith. It is the avoidance of a responsibility, wearing the language of faith so convincingly that it never has to be examined or named for what it is. Luke chapter 14, verse 28 asks it plainly in Jesus' own words. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Jesus is not describing a construction project for its own sake. He is describing discipleship itself, and he assumes, without apology, that counting the cost is a normal part of wisdom, not evidence of a lack of trust. Refusing to plan does not prove your faith is large. Far more often, it proves your discipline is small, and quietly hopes no one, including God, won the will. Notice the difference between the two. A budget is not a lack of trust in God's provision. It is simply an honest account of what has already been provided, kept, so it can be stewarded well instead of spent by accident. This is heavy. I know that. But you are still here because something in you knows you needed to hear it. That is not coincidence. Subscribe to the Bible warnings. Write in the comments, "I will steward what God has given me." And let us go deeper, because the next 2 habits are the ones most teaching on money never touches at all. Item 5. Hoarding under the disguise of security. How much would actually be enough before you finally felt safe? Would that number change if it doubled tomorrow? Has any amount you have ever reached in the past actually produced the peace you expected it to produce once you got there? Most believers cannot answer any of those three questions honestly because the target keeps moving every time it is approached. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24 and 25 says, "There is one who scatters, yet increases more, and there is one who withholds more than is right, but it leads to poverty. The generous soul will be made rich, and he who waters will also be watered himself." This is not a prosperity formula promising a return on investment. It is a spiritual observation about what happens over time to a heart that closes its hand permanently, always saving for a security that generosity was actually designed to produce in the first place, not undermine. Choose one specific act of generosity this week that costs you something measurable, not symbolic, not the spare change giving that changes nothing about your week. Let it be uncomfortable enough that it actually reveals whether your hand is open or closed. Item 6. Complaining about lack. Instead of confessing contentment, consider a Christian who has enough to eat, a place to sleep, and clothing appropriate for the season, and who nonetheless narrates their entire financial life almost exclusively in the language of shortage. Every conversation eventually returns to what is missing. Every social media post implies scarcity, even when the underlying reality is stability. The complaint becomes so constant, so habitual, that it starts to function as a kind of prayer, except it is directed outward at the world and inward at self-pity, not upward toward God, and it is slowly reshaping the heart rather than surrendering it to anyone. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 to 8 says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out, and having food and clothing, with these we shall be content." Paul is not describing poverty as some spiritual goal to aspire to. He is describing a heart that has finally stopped measuring its own worth by whatever remains uncollected. Contentment is not resignation, and it is not the absence of ambition. It is the one financial discipline that quietly makes every other discipline on this list sustainable for the long run. Without it, tithing becomes resentful, generosity becomes performative, and planning becomes anxious rather than peaceful, because the heart underneath every habit is still convinced there is not enough. None of these 6 habits are actually about restriction, even though every one of them will feel that way the first time you try to change it. Every one of them, examined closely, is God protecting something in you that money alone cannot repair once it breaks. Your trust, your patience, your contentment, your generosity, your ability to wait for something without resenting the wait. He is not closing his hand toward your finances. In several of these habits, you have been the one closing yours and calling it caution, or calling it faith, or simply calling it the way things are for someone in your situation. This is not God limiting what you can have. This is God covering what you would eventually lose if these patterns continued unexamined for another year, another decade, another lifetime. The habits that feel like freedom in the moment, the borrowing, the comparison, the hoarding, the constant complaint, are the very things quietly working against the actual freedom you have been asking Him for in your prayers all along. You do not have to fix all 6 this week. You do not even have to fix one of them perfectly. What changes everything is simply naming the one that is currently true of you and bringing it, specifically by name, into your prayer instead of leaving it in the vague category of finances where it has been hiding for years, unexamined and unnamed. A vague prayer produces a vague change. A specific confession spoken honestly is usually where the actual freedom begins. If even one of these 6 landed somewhere specific in your life today, write, "I will steward what God has given me," in the comments below. Let it be an actual decision, not just a sentence you type and scroll past. Share this with someone you know is carrying financial anxiety in silence. This may be the reframe they have been needing for a long time without ever knowing how to ask for it. Subscribe to the Bible Warnings so you do not miss what comes next. And whatever this month holds for your finances, may your hand stay open, and may your trust be settled long before the number ever is.